All right, just a couple of housekeeping points before we continue. One is, in looking at last week's homework, I think the thing that struck me was just how many of you painted the object but didn't paint any kind of a background, okay? And so going forward, I want you not to use any kind of a white background, put drapes down so that you get some kind of value or color behind the object. White, pure white out of the tube or the pure white of your canvas really has no place in a painting when you're talking about trying to duplicate the sense of light. It's too divorced from anything that we see in nature. There are times when pure white and pure black can work in a painting. I'm not saying they can't, but for our purposes here, I want you to just no longer think in terms of ever leaving an area of your canvas pure white. All right, there won't be a need for it. All right, so that's number one. Number two is I think it would be helpful for everybody to go ahead and tape the edge of your paper. If you're using paper, just tape the edge before you start painting. That way, when you take the tape off, like I took the tape off of this study that I did, you see you get a really nice kind of clean boundary to the painting, which just allows you to allows you to see it a little bit better, and it just makes it look nicer. So tape the boundary of your painting from now on. All right. So now we've talked about the properties of color, hue, value, chroma, temperature. Those 5 ideas that help us understand why we see the color that we see that we talked about in the last video. So how do we take those ideas and then actually use our tube color to mix the colors that we see in nature? So that's the next issue that we're going to deal with. The starting place is when you look at nature to make sure that you are judging a consolidated, definite shape in nature, not just to sort of see the world as this kind of fuzzy, undifferentiated areas of color coming up against one another. I've had you make shapes because that's how we have to think about color mixing. We have to take what we see in nature and consolidate it into a discernible shape that we can then judge. So that's the first step, is just determining for yourself what's that shape that I see out there. Okay, given the the local color that I see and the color of the light source, how does that color shape relate to my palette color, right? And the palette that we're going to start with color is a traditional 4-color palette. It's a palette that artists have used through history, and it's really, when you get right down to it, it's really any palette when you're really kind of simplifying, and that is the primaries and white. So red, yellow, blue, and white. That's our beginning place. And what I'm going to have you guys do is use your ultramarine blue, cad yellow, and cad red, and then your white. So those will be your those 4 colors. All right, so you put those out. Then when you see that shape in nature, you'll say, okay, was that shape, is it, if I have to pick a camp for that shape to go into it, is it the red camp, the blue camp, or the yellow camp? All right, and that's the beginning place to pick the color that you start with, okay? And then once you've picked that color, then the process of arriving at it by mixing is just asking yourself, okay, in terms of the other 3 properties, temperature, value, and chromatic intensity, how does that color in nature differ from this hue that I've chosen to start with, whether it be red, yellow, blue? Okay, so I've got a red here. It's not your cadmium red. This is a magenta that I've used. So yours won't look exactly like this, but the idea is the same. All right, so let's say that the color that I looked at out there seemed to relate to the red camp. Okay, so I begin there with my magenta. All right. So, but that doesn't look anything like the red that I see out there. So then I ask myself, okay, in terms of value, do I have to lighten my tube color that I put out on my palette or darken it to get closer to that color that I see? All right, so that's number 1 with value, and that's fairly easy. We can lighten a color in basically one of 2 ways, either by adding a lighter color to it, right? Like if I start with red, I can go to a yellow and make it lighter, right? Or I can add a white to it. That's going to make it lighter. Okay, in terms of going darker, I can just pick a darker color like blue. And that's really, with a 4-color palette, that's my only option. If I had a fuller palette, I could use, darker earth color or black or whatever. So value is pretty easy to decide, like how to go up or down. Now, how you go lighter or darker is going to also impact potentially temperature and chromatic intensity. So it's not, there's a little bit more that has to go into your thinking. So it's important at the beginning to just sort of run through these 4 options before you actually start mixing. So if I decide, okay, the color's lighter in value, then the next thing is temperature. Is that warmer or cooler? All right, and warmer, I can just put a warmer color in. Cooler, I can put a colder color into it, right? And then chromatic intensity. People sometimes get a little confused with chromatic intensity. Chromatic intensity you can shift in a number of ways. All right, so here I've got my original color, and I've added a white to it, which is called a tint. So that lightens the value, but it also lowers the chromatic intensity. So even though this pink seems pretty strong, I realize, if you could see this color clearly, you see that it's also reduced intensity. Like the white obviously doesn't add any kind of saturation or power to that red. All it does is cut it, right? So a tint to a color will, in most cases, will lower the chromatic intensity. All right, so this color, and then here's my original again, and I've added black to it here, and that's called a shade, all right? So a shade will also reduce the chromatic intensity of the original in most cases. And then I've added a little bit of white to it, so I've tinted my shade just so you can see it a little bit more clearly, how it's grayed out and is less chromatic, all right? So a tint and a shade, in most situations, will lower the chromatic intensity. And then the third way that I can lower the chromatic intensity is to add the complement of the color. So in this line here, I've added a dark green. That's sort of the complement of this color on my palette. So, and that goes really dark again. So I've added a white to it. So again, I've tinted that complementary mixture, and you can see how that color is grayed from the original. All right, so that reduces the chromatic intensity. You can also reduce the chromatic intensity by just picking a color that's maybe not a pure complement, but that tends towards that complementary color. That will also reduce the chromatic intensity of your original. All right, so just taking those ideas, then let's say that we look at nature and we see this color right here. All right, that's out there, someone's skin tone or whatever, right? So we look at that and we say, okay, how do I take this magenta and get there? If that's my only choice of red, because I would put this into red camp in terms of hue. That's where I would start. I would say, okay, it's more red than it is yellow or blue, right? So I would start there. So that means I'm starting with this color, all right? But how does it then relate in terms of value, chromatic intensity, and temperature? Okay, so it's lighter in value. It's lower in chromatic intensity, and it's warmer in temperature than this color here. All right, so if I just add white to this color to get it higher in value, I'm going to end up with something like this, right? Which is still too chromatic. So I can add kind of a green, which is a little bit of a green, which is a mixture of yellow and blue, and that will reduce the chromatic intensity. It's going to kill this color a little bit, and make it a little bit more like this. And if I have a little bit more yellow than blue in it, then it's also going to warm that color. And without too much problem, I'm going to get to a color like this fairly easily. All right, so there's no big mystery to color mixing if you stay concentrated on just those 4 properties of color and how the color you're seeing in nature differs from what you're seeing on your palette. Okay, so what I'm going to have you guys do is first you're going to put down your 3 primary colors, your cad yellow light, your cad red light, and your ultramarine blue, and you're going to mix, like I've done here, a tint, a shade, and then a complement, okay? And if it's really dark, add a little bit of white so that you can see like how that's sort of reducing the chromatic intensity, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign you a number of color mixing problems that won't be based on anything that you actually see in nature. Those just be questions basically that I'm gonna give you, and I'll ask you to mix up colors that respond to those questions that I give you.